Welcome to the UN Brief. I interviewed Ambassador Marc Finaud, France's top negotiator at the Conference on Disarmament in Geneva for many years, and former head of arms proliferation and head of diplomatic Tradecraft, and now fellow at the Geneva Centre for Security Policy. We spoke about the 10th Review Conference of the Parties on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons Treaty and the current threat landscape in view of the hostilities in Ukraine. We spoke about the historical context and the format of the conference and how the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, the US, China, Russia, France, and the UK, are presenting reports on their progress, overcoming hurdles to implement the Non-Proliferation Treaty and seeking consensus, or rather, how they are not succeeding. Thank you for watching the UN Brief, and don't forget to subscribe. Ambassador, what is being discussed in New York, and how much is the current global peace and security landscape with the ongoing Russian hostilities in Ukraine affecting the negotiations of the Non-Proliferation Treaty?
Well, actually, this meeting is called a review conference. So it's about it's a provision in the Non-Proliferation Treaty that this treaty needs to be regularly monitored and reviewed every 5 years. So this process has started after the treaty entered into force. So it's a sort of regular meeting, regular rendezvous of the international community to look at what has been done or not done to implement the various provisions or pillars of the treaty. As you know, there are 3 pillars. One is non-proliferation, preventing new states from acquiring nuclear weapons. Then is disarmament. Those states that possess these weapons have pledged to disarm, to eliminate these weapons. And third is to promote, to facilitate, to cooperate in the peaceful uses of nuclear energy. So on those 3 pillars, this conference is meant to examine what has been going on. Of course, now it's a longer period because it was supposed to take place 2 years ago. It was postponed because of the COVID pandemic. So it will be looking back at what has been achieved or not in all these 3 pillars.
So that is really an ongoing conference that covers making sure that countries that are signatories of the Non-Proliferation Treaty are actually implementing it.
Exactly. And of course, you mentioned the international security context. Well, in a sense, there is always an international context, of course, with ups and downs, more tensions or not, but beyond and despite these tensions in the past, it has been possible to move forward, to adopt new measures to make sure that the promises made initially are implemented. So now we see, after more than 50 years of implementation of the treaty, a great frustration, because of course you could say that the non-proliferation pillar has been largely implemented. There's been actually only one state, North Korea, that withdrew from the treaty and developed nuclear weapons. Of course, the 3 others have never signed the treaty, so they were not covered by these obligations. That's India, Pakistan, and Israel. But all the rest basically fulfill their obligations, which are very strict, because non-nuclear weapon state accept to let the International Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA, inspect all their activities and installations regarding nuclear energy. The problem is more with the second pillar, disarmament. Well, for actually 15 years after the treaty entered into force between 1970 and 1985, nuclear weapons arsenals continue to grow despite this pledge of disarmament. And they started to decrease.
What happens? Because I imagine it has to do with new technologies too, that kind of they need to change the way they have the warheads, well, or whatever, all this.
Yes, there were
the way they manage
types of changing the arsenals more. For first of all, during the Cold War, it was more quantitative, increasing the number of warheads and missiles, means of delivery. And then when the arsenal started to decrease at the peak of the Cold War from 70,000 down now to something like 13,000, well, at the same time, there were modernization programs to reduce sometimes the destructive power of the warheads to make actually them more usable in combat situations. There were investment in hypersonic missiles, which would evade detection, defensive systems. So there was this arms race finally all the time, despite this promise again in Article 6 of the NPT to stop the arms race at an early date, more than 50 years ago. And so we are in this situation, and this has led to a lot of frustration among the non-nuclear weapon states, which have fulfilled their obligations and realize that the nuclear weapon states have not. And therefore, there is this several attempts. Back in 2000, there were 13 steps adopted to increase implementation, especially on disarmament. In 2010, there was a big action plan of 64 actions, including about 30 actions for nuclear disarmament. But unfortunately, none of this has been implemented. So this frustration led to a series of conferences on the humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons, and that led to the adoption of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, meaning filling a legal gap, because the NPT didn't talk about this, didn't mention whether any use of nuclear weapons would be illegal. So to fill this gap, it was decided to prohibit, of course, use, but also possession or development of nuclear weapons. And so now this creates a new situation. And this will be the first review conference after entry into force of the new treaty. And obviously this will be discussed because this new treaty has been rejected by the nuclear powers and their allies. And therefore, they accuse the non-nuclear weapon states of dividing the international community.
I'd like you to speak a little bit, to give us some context. What are the risks for Europe of this conflict in Ukraine is spreading? And also because there were these assertions by the president of Russia of, somewhat veiled threats, right? I don't know, a couple of months ago, I think it was March. So I don't know how much this is just bravado. Secretary of State Blinken yesterday said, too, in the opening of the session of the meeting in New York, that it's impossible. You cannot use weapons of mass destruction because there is no way to repair it afterwards, right?
Humanitarian consequences of any use, intentional or accidental or terrorist, of nuclear weapons, that it was decided to ban them, and in the hope that this will put pressure on the possessor states to eliminate these weapons. And those threats by Russia in its war against Ukraine have actually changed even the official discourse or doctrine of nuclear weapon states, which said, our weapons are defensive to deter any attack against our vital interests. Now we can see that those threats are serious, they are credible, they are realistic, and actually they are used to justify or to make an aggression easier for a nuclear weapon state against a non-nuclear weapon state, because they know that they have impunity. They can use this sort of blackmail, taking whole countries, populations as hostages and facilitating their aggressive behavior. So this is, this explains why there is such a mobilization, not against specific countries or regimes, but against the weapons themselves. And there was this statement at the NPT review conference by the Western nuclear powers, US, UK, and France, basically saying, we are the good guys, our weapons are defensive, but not like Russia or China. So this is wrong. This has been said several times by Secretary Generals of the UN, Kofi Annan, Ban Ki-moon, now Antonio Guterres, the head of the International Red Cross, the Catholic Pope. You cannot envisage any form of use of nuclear weapons that would be compatible with international law. It's not a moral, ethical question. It's just that you cannot discriminate between civilians and military targets. You cannot prevent collateral damage. So therefore, these weapons are intrinsically indiscriminate, and they are against international law. So again, there is no way to continue to justify possession of these weapons for defensive purposes. Again, to quote the Secretary Generals of the UN, there are not any good hands for bad weapons.
Nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. I think Biden said that. You mentioned that too. It is not something that we should be contemplating. And Ben, going back to the Non-Proliferation Treaty conference that's taking place now in New York, what is on the agenda of the meeting? Give us a bit of historical context in this kind of events, conferences, and why the news media and the general public should pay attention to these meetings.
Yes, well, again, as sort of tradition, there is first a general debate. So this is where you can hear high-level speakers, presidents, ministers express the views and concerns of their countries. And then there is the work that diplomats do, which is really to go almost paragraph by paragraph of the treaty, article by article, in three main committees to look at the three pillars. And then they express views, they make proposals, there are working papers, documents, and hopefully at the end, that's how you judge the success of a conference like this. You try to achieve a common consensus, a document that will rally support from everyone. In principle, you don't vote. You try to get consensus. If there are any objections, then there is no document. This is what happened at the previous review conference in 2015 and in the past also. So we don't know. There will be a lot of discussion, a lot of negotiation on these ideas, how to move forward. But we know there is a lot of resistance as well. And so it will be difficult to achieve consensus. We know that.
So all the 5P, the members of the Security Council, are participating, and they present reports of their countries' advances or how they are managing arsenal and so on and so forth. Is that a bit what happens, or is just more working papers and just a sort of review in general, or countries have to present a report of sorts?
Yes, there was actually one of these measures adopted in the past was requirements from all the state parties that the nuclear weapon states present a report about their policies and explain how they implement their obligations. And so it's good in a sense that we have increase in transparency, but it's, of course, very unequal. Some states are more transparent than others, and it doesn't change, dramatically their policies. They explain, they try to justify why they need to keep these weapons for their security and the security of their allies. And there is no real commitment or plan of action, even any resumption of negotiations between the US and Russia, which are now suspended, about reduction of their arsenals. So we'll see again, based on those reports, if they are serious and if they demonstrate their commitment to go forward and adopt more measures. I think there are a number of emergency, very urgent measures that could be adopted to reduce the risk of use of nuclear weapons. Like one of them, which has been on the agenda for many years, is called no first use. So if all the nuclear weapon states say we will not use nuclear weapons first if we are attacked, that means that they will not respond by using nuclear weapons if they are attacked with other weapons, conventional weapons, cyber, chemical, etc., which will reduce dramatically the risk of escalation to a global nuclear war. But we consider there is still resistance even to this fairly symbolic or modest measure, but that could pave the way for more progress towards disarmament.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Marc Finaud. He was head of arms proliferation at the Geneva Centre for Security Policy and is still an associate fellow with the Geneva Centre for Security Policy and also a consultant. And he was head of diplomatic Tradecraft and was ambassador representing France in the negotiations on the conference in disarmament in Geneva for several years. Thank you for watching the UN Brief, and don't forget to subscribe.